Chapter 6 deals with human population. So a lot of the principles from the population ecology in Chapter 5 apply to the human population, but then it gets a lot more complicated because we can control and manipulate things unlike any other organism. The case study focuses on China. You've almost definitely heard of China's one-child policy. Read the case study because you may have some misconceptions about what that policy actually entails. Now China is dealing with some demographic issues, an aging population, more males than females. So it's even more complicated than presented in this case study. All right, so one question a lot of people ask when talking about the human population is, do we have a carrying capacity for humans? That would be known as the cultural carrying capacity. There's not really a good question or a good answer to that. There are a lot of different ways you can answer that question. But basically, human population, and we've looked at kind of a graph of human population growth over time, has been pretty much exponential, more J-shaped curve, starting to become a little more S-shaped. The main reason why the human population has increased so rapidly, particularly in the past century, is due to a decrease in death rates. So not an increase in birth rates, but just people are not dying as quickly as they were, which is a good thing. Currently, so as of October 2017, our population in the world was about 7.6 billion people. So pretty soon we'll be up to 8 billion. When we look at where population growth is occurring, as you can see in figure 6.3, it's mostly in the less developed countries. The more developed countries have pretty much stagnant population growth overall, just slight growth, and then it's about 9 times higher in the less developed countries. So current population stats for as of 2017, in China, there are about 1.41 billion people, India 1.34 billion. If you can just remember that China and India both have over 1 billion people, that's super important. Third most populous country is the United States. Right now we're at about 325 million. Again, knowing that we're over 300 million is good. And then we're followed by Indonesia and Brazil. All right. The science focus on page 128 does a nice job of kind of going through how population projections are made and some different factors that can affect that, like the reliability of data, assumptions that are made about total fertility. They give the example with Kenya. They assumed fertility rates would go down. They actually went up. And then what data sets are being used and what methods are being used. So they give you some different projections, which is why oftentimes when they look at human population projections, there'll be a little dashed line after wherever the current population data ends. And sometimes you'll see different growth rates depending on different projections. And then the science focus on page 129 does a nice job of emphasizing that P in HIPCO for human population. So basically, how are we able to survive? How do we keep our carrying capacity going up? We're kind of doing some bad things to the world. So those are summarized in that natural capital degradation box right there, figure 6b. All right, so factors that influence size of human population. Just like when we're looking at any other population, we can use birth and immigration, and then death and emigration rates to calculate population change. Another thing that often is used is crude birth rate and crude death rate. Those are rates per 1,000. So if you're given just crude birth rate and crude death rate and you're looking at what's the population change, you could just do CBR minus CDR and then divide it by 10. Because they're per 1,000, it will give you a percentage. Terms that come up a lot in this chapter are fertility rate. So fertility rate is the number of children that a woman has during her lifetime. And there are 2 terms that revolve around that. Replacement level fertility rate would be the number of children that a couple has to replace themselves. So in the more developed countries, it's about 2.1. And in the less developed countries, it's about 2.5 because fewer children make it to reproductive age. The total fertility rate, or TFR, which is a number used very often when looking at demographics, is the average number of children per woman in an entire country. So you can see in a lot of the different images and graphs in this text. They use total fertility rate. Great case study about the baby boom, which is a U.S. phenomenon post-World War II. My parents are both baby boomers. So basically anyone born between the years of 1946 and 1964 are baby boomers. So had an increase in the human population, particularly in the United States. That has a really big impact. Think back to the IPAT, right? Impact as a result of population, affluence, and technology. And here in the United States, because we are so affluent, that's a problem. We have a lot of resources that we use. But baby boom increased the number of children that were born. And then there was an echo baby boom when all of those baby boomers reproduced. I'm part of the echo baby boom. And now birth rates are going down again. All right, and you can see figure 6-7 just does a nice job kind of comparing some things between 1900 and 2000 in the United States. So you can see how a lot of these things have changed. So factors that affect birth rates. One is the importance of children as part of a labor force. If children are part of the labor force, that means that your families are more likely to have more children. The cost of raising and educating children, as that goes up, people tend to have fewer kids. Right now, I think it's estimated to be like $235,000 to raise a child to the age of 18 here in the United States. And that, of course, will vary depending on where in the U.S. you live. The availability of pension systems. These are things like Social Security, which is a public pension system here in the U.S., or a 401k. It used to be that a lot of companies here provided pensions, and now most of them don't. So who's going to support you in your retirement? If you have a pension system, you might be okay on your own. If there is no pension system, your kids are going to support you. So you want to make sure you have enough of them to do that. Infant mortality rate, so how likely children are to die, will affect birth rates. The higher that infant death rate is, the higher the birth rate is, because people want to ensure that at least some of their children will survive. Urbanization affects birth rates. Basically, more urban areas, birth rates tend to go down. Rural areas, birth rates tend to be higher. Educational employment opportunities for women, super important, because when women have education, they'll stay in school longer. They have employment opportunities. They are less likely to marry at a young age and have lots of kids. So the average age of marriage is connected to that. The availability of legal abortions will affect the birth rates. That makes sense. And then, of course, religious beliefs, cultural norms, and traditions. Excuse me. And that kind of ties into why there are more male children than female children in China with that one-child policy, which is in that little connections box on page 133. So factors that affect death rates. Basically, why have death rates gone down? We have increased food supplies and better distribution of that food, better nutrition, medical advances, namely immunizations and antibiotics, improved sanitation, yay, indoor plumbing, and safer water supplies. Excuse me. So you can kind of judge how healthy a population is by looking at the life expectancy and then also the infant mortality rates. Those are deaths before the age of 1. Child mortality rates are before the age of 5. So countries that have very high life expectancy and very low infant mortality rates are considered to be the healthiest. The United States infant mortality rate has gone down significantly over the past century, but it's still pretty high compared to a lot of the more developed countries. So that's sad. Another thing with the U.S. in terms of population, immigration is the major factor driving U.S. population growth. According to a demographer and some Pew Research, by 2065 it could account for upwards of 88% of all growth. And with a lot of the most developed countries, immigration is some of them are actually really encouraging immigration because their population growth is so low. But we'll get into that in a moment. Age structure diagrams. I love age structure diagrams. They're so useful because they can help to predict growth rates. As we can see in figure 612, the age structure diagram basically groups people into 3 categories: pre-reproductive, so under the age of 14, reproductive, between 15 and 44, so those are the ages when people are most likely to be having children, and then post-reproductive, after 45. There are always exceptions to these, but those are generalities. So the more pyramid-shaped, basically, the age structure diagram is, the more quickly that population will grow as the pre-reproductive individuals become or reach reproductive age and then add to that population. That's known as population momentum. Excuse me. And we can see down figure 613, comparing more developed countries and less developed countries, their age structure diagrams. You can definitely see how that relates to the earlier graph showing population growth. And then we have age structure diagrams showing the baby boom here in the United States and how that has kind of affected things. So currently we have a lot of people who are retiring now, and that is adding additional strain onto Social Security, healthcare, etc. Some populations are going down, some kind of rapidly, and that can have some negative consequences as well, particularly social and economic. So increasing populations definitely have environmental impacts, but when your population is rapidly declining, that can have some impacts as well, as seen in figure 615. And then HIV/AIDS, which is covered more in chapter 17, has impacted population growth rates as well. I'll give you the example in 616, looking at Botswana, like what would the population look like with AIDS versus without AIDS. And AIDS oftentimes tends to affect people in their reproductive ages because those are people who are more likely to be sexually active and transmitting AIDS, but then of course it can be passed on from mother to child, etc. All right, so how can we actually slow population growth? This gets into the demographic transition. So as you can see here in figure 617, super important. Basically the first stage, pre-industrial. High birth rates, high death rates, they pretty much even out, so this is low growth. This is where human populations were until the past couple hundred years. Stage 2 is the transitional stage. So this is when death rates start to go down. Think about all those factors that affect death rates. So all of a sudden you have, the medical advances and sanitation, etc. So death rate goes down, but the birth rates tend to be more influenced by cultural things, and those shifts take longer. So birth rates remain high, so you get high growth. And then towards the end of the transitional stage, the birth rate starts to lower, and then you get into stage 3, which is industrial. And there is no set, and when the birth rate and death rate equal this, that's when you move into industrial. But stage 3 is the industrial stage, so we get slower growth, the birth rate's going down, the death rate continues to go down, they start to level out. And then when you get into stage 4, post-industrial, that's when the birth rate really starts to drop. The death rate's kind of maintaining now. So you have zero growth or maybe even negative growth. Some resources will refer to stage 5 with negative growth, but generally on the APES exam, they stick to 4 stages. So one of the most important things you can do to slow population growth is to empower women. So give them those educational and employment opportunities so they can have their own income, access to family planning, contraception, and then equal rights is also very important as part of that. When we talk about family planning, so information about how can you space out children, access to birth control and contraceptives, all of that reduces total fertility rates. Okay? It will lower abortion rates and decreases maternal and fetal deaths. There's a great case study on what they've been doing in India. Really nice to compare this to China and how they've been dealing with population growth because these are our 2 largest populations and they're both growing, but India is expected to grow faster than China. And that's pretty much chapter 6.